Good afternoon. Welcome back. In 1758, the great Swedish botanist and taxonomist Carolus Linnaeus dubbed the human species Homo sapiens, literally wise man. In doing so, he identified what commentators before and after him have identified as a defining characteristic of humans, namely our remarkable cognitive abilities. We're smart, but we're not just smart in any way. Lots of species are better at remembering where things have been hidden. Some birds, for example, recall the hiding places of hundreds of seeds months later. Some species are much better than us at navigating from one place to another. Consider an albatross, for example, that wanders 2,500 miles across the southern oceans and finds its way back to a tiny island just north of Antarctica. Plenty of species, too, can use built-in trigonometry to locate sounds better than we can. A barn owl can catch a mouse in complete darkness. Or they can read the stories of passers-by from smells alone. Think of walking with your dog. No, we are remarkable in a different way. We are wise. Webster's dictionary defines this as marked by deep understanding, keen discernment, and a capacity for sound judgment. What we are particularly wise about is each other. What is really remarkable about humans is the degree to which we understand that others have an inner life and thoughts and motivations just as we do. And we can use that information to understand and get ahead in social situations. To quote from a paper by our next speaker, it can make sense to us that Peter knows that Jane believes that Mark thinks that Paula wants Jake to suppose that Amelia intends to do something. Just try to get a gorilla to understand that. Homo sapiens, you could say, is the ultimate social networking species. But we're certainly not the only social species out there. Lots of species live in family or other social groups, from bats to birds to lions to apes. Baboons, for example, live in socially complex species, or socially complex societies of tens of individuals in which pairs reinforce their relationships through reciprocal grooming and through pairwise friendships. What makes us different from them? Well, two things certainly require an explanation: our big brain and our capacity for language. Great minds have puzzled over both of these. One of those great minds is in our next speaker, Dr. Robin I.M. Dunbar, Fellow of the British Academy, co-director of the Academy's Lucy to Language project on the archaeology of the social brain, and director of Oxford University's Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology. Dr. Dunbar grew up in East Africa, a wildlife biologist's mecca, but claims his family and he never had any particular interest in animals beyond shooting them. He went to school in England, but didn't have any particular interest in science. He got to Oxford University as an undergraduate, intent on studying philosophy, only to learn that he had to double major in something else. So he took psychology and ended up in a class taught by Nobel Prize-winning animal behaviorist Nico Tinbergen. Tinbergen's insight was that behavior can be shaped by natural selection as well as bodies can. And it's been in this interface between behavior, ecology, psychology, and evolution that Dr. Dunbar has devoted his professional life. Robin Dunbar's research life stands as a testimony to a curious mind. He has studied the social behavior of colobus monkeys and sexual segregation in feral goats, social displays in chimpanzees, and social displays by humans looking for love in the personal ads. He has studied the evolution of brain size in primates and the theory of mind in Shakespeare's plays. And of course, he has studied and written extensively on the evolution of the social brain, language, and what makes humans different from all the other species. Please welcome Dr. Robin Dunbar.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's a rare privilege. About a month ago, I was at a meeting in London, and I happened to mention to somebody that I was going to some rather obscure part of North America that I'd never been to before, to a conference there, and he just went, Gustavus, the Nobels. So you'll be glad to know that the fame of these meetings has spread across into Europe, the other side of the American Channel. Okay. I'm going to give you kind of a rather broad talk in a way and try and pull a lot of different things together. The kind of story I'm going to try and weave for you, and I'll try and show you some data on the way just to prove that it's not all speculation, is really why we aren't just great apes. We are great apes biologically, that's our family. And indeed, we're buried right in the middle of it. We're not even kind of on the edge. We are our nearest biological species, as it were, the chimpanzees, as I'm sure you well know, and we're much more closely related to them, for example, than the two subspecies of gorilla are related to each other. So we really are buried very deeply. But clearly, even though primates are incredibly smart, and we know, here's Kanzi, for example, the famous bonobo who can communicate with his handlers through his talking board, as it were. They can do all sorts of clever experiments. Nonetheless, in the end, as I'm sure you well know here, they have not yet sent anybody to the moon. And there's all sorts of other things, clearly, that we've done which they haven't. And I'm going to just finger these two here. This is literally fingering it, isn't it? Religion and storytelling as something that demarcates humans in particular, and they're kind of iconic of what I think is the big difference between us and all other species. And this is not to set us on a pedestal and say we're special in any way. In the end, we're just another unique species. But it is to try and understand why it is we're not just another great ape in the course of our history. And I think that comes down to our ability to live in the kind of virtual mental world of the imagination, inside our own minds. And it's that capacity which has given us that. It is that capacity which has given us science. It's our ability to be able to step back from the world and say, I wonder why it's like that. Could it be another way? And that's what writing a novel is all about. Here's another way the world could have been. No other species of animal, I'm absolutely convinced, can do that. Their noses are thrust right up against the grindstone of the world, and they simply can't step back far enough to do it. Okay, so where does all this start? It starts with the social brain hypothesis, which is an explanation for why primates have unusually large brains for body size compared to any other group of animals. And the proposal which was put 20 years ago now is that because primates live in unusually complex social systems, their societies are dynamic, complex. Machiavellian was the term that was used originally, although a lot of people haven't liked that. And that kind of constant, dynamic, changing pattern of relationships just requires a big computer to handle it. So some of the evidence that was put forward to support that eventually is of this kind here. You can plot something like social group size as a crude measure of social complexity against some measure of brain size. We've always used neocortex ratio, or relative size of the neocortex, because that's the bit of the brain that's exploded in size in primates. Your neocortex, it's a sheet, about a yard square. It accounts for 80% of your total brain volume, and the reason our brains are so convoluted is trying to wrap this huge sheet around the inner core of the mammalian brain, and it's where all the clever stuff goes on, basically. If you do that, then you get these nice grade lines here, where within grades of sociality is what it turns out, the size of group you live in is a function of the size of your neocortex. And down here are the apes, who seem to have to work harder, computationally, if you like, to support a group of a particular size than, say, any of the monkeys. Well, that was the story. We first proposed that and showed this evidence to support this in 94, 2 years ago. Suzanne, actually, no, I'm jumping ahead of myself now. Let me just show the kind of complexity that is involved or that people sort of viewed here. And indeed, you can look at lots of different behavioral measures of complexity. For example, here, the amount of what's called tactical deception plotted against brain size. Again, it goes up. Whether you use coalitions in your relationships, allies to protect yourself, species that do have a much bigger relative neocortex size, relative brain size than primate species that don't. And just to illustrate these kind of complexities, I'll give you two examples here. This one is a very well-known one. Some of you may have read about it. It's Hans Kummer's observation of Hamadryas baboons. Hamadryas baboons live in Ethiopia. They live in large groups of families. And each family, in effect, is a male with several females. And the males guard their monopoly of these females absolutely jealously. And Kummer once watched a female inch her way behind a rock here. Took her 20 minutes to get there. And then when she was behind the rock, she started grooming with this young male from the family next door. Now, Kummer says they did this for quite a long time. She never seemed to let her guard down, is how he puts it, and drop her head below the rock, which she could easily have done. She always seemed to position herself so her head was visible across the top of the rock. And his sort of charitable view of smart primates, if you like, was to say, well, look, what she's really doing is saying, so long as the old fool can see my head, he'll think I'm just innocently sitting here. These are some of my own study species, the gelada. This is family rivalry, sibling rivalry, really. This is mum here. She's got her head down. She's being groomed by her younger daughter. This is her older daughter. Now, you remember this, those of you with little sisters or big sisters. Just look where her hand is, right? She's got it right behind there. She's trying to ease her little sister away so she can get in to groom mom. Because being mom's grooming partner gives you advantages. But look where her head is. She's looking down very carefully, watching mum's response. Because mum is kind of asleep, being groomed like this. She's very relaxed and, sort of half asleep. Watching very carefully to make sure that mum doesn't know. Because if mum realizes what's going on, there's hell to pay. Well, it's that kind of social complexity that's at issue. Okay. So that was the story until about 2 years ago. And then Suzanne Schultz and I tried to look at a number of other groups to see of animals, to see if this story held there too. People have been trying to do that with very mixed results. And we got a big shock because it turned out that in every other group we looked at, and we looked at three big families of mammals, the carnivores, the deer antelope group, the ungulates, and the bats, as well as a very large sample of birds, spanning the whole spectrum of birds, about 137 bird species in here, covering almost all groups. In every single case, it's species in pair-bonded monogamous relationships that have big brains. Right? So this is relative brain size here, and the line is the average for the group, if you like. If you're above it, you've got much bigger than average. And these are essentially solitary species here, monogamous pair-bonded species, kind of harem living species, and species that live in very large multi-male, multi-female flocks or herds. And you can see that for all these groups, it's pair-bonded species that have big brains. The only exception to this is in the primates. And do what you like to these data, you cannot get this quantitative relationship between group size and brain size to disappear. And you don't really get a very strong signal of any kind of monogamous effect. There's a weak one at best. And this rather surprised us. It was not at all clear what was going on, but clearly at some point in the course of primate evolutionary history, and that means very early on, because remember, the primates are one of the oldest largely unchanged groups of mammals in the world. Their ancestors were kicking around with the dinosaurs. Well, actually, everybody's ancestors are kicking around with the dinosaurs. But these have changed least among certainly these other widely distributed groups of mammals. What we know now is that this has to do with bonding or pair bonding in monogamous relationships, because the birds do that very nicely for us, because in the birds you can split them up into those that have lifelong pair bonds, those that have annual pair bonds like many of your garden birds, which repair each spring, and those that never have permanent pair bonds. It's the lifelong pair bonders have unusually big brains when you partial out anything else you want to get rid of. And these are all, for those of you who are bothered about these things, I'll just say these are controlled for phylogenetic relationships. So the question is, why are pair bonds so demanding cognitively? What is it about a pair bond that makes it so demanding? We think there are two. Suzanne thinks it's this stuff down here. She's a girl, and she's worried about sort of choosing the right mate and mate quality. And it's clear that, if you make a bum choice, particularly if it's a lifelong pair bond, which you in effect can't get out of because it's kind of, you're locked into it, then that's not a very good idea. It doesn't do much good for your biological fitness. I actually tend to think this is the real problem here. Is behavioral coordination and synchrony over the course of every day of your life. Because the problem with this stuff is, once you've made your decision, you picked a good mate, you're away, you don't have to worry about it again. Why should you need a big brain after that? But this stuff, this is an everyday problem. And if you think of it in bird terms, you've got a lot of very careful scheduling to do on a day-by-day basis when the eggs and the chicks are in the nest. Because if you go down to the bar downtown and don't come back till 4 in the morning, it's not such a problem for humans, maybe, but for birds, that's a serious problem, because your mate, be it the male or the female, cannot manage to survive that long without feeding. So you've got to have a much more tightly coordinated scheduling. You've kind of got to understand what it is your mate needs, really, and factor that into how you organize your life. So I really rather think that this is why this is a problem. And with lifelong monogamous species that live together permanently, this goes on day by day by day. Well, you know that. I don't have to tell you. Okay, so where does this leave us with humans? Well, we can plug humans into this same primate graph. Here are the apes down here. We can plug humans in. For the benefit of the graduate students here, I should just point out that all this data on primate brains came from the same lab, as it happens in Germany. They had a few students that were late on their term papers, so their penalty was to contribute their brains to science. So we can plug humans in at the appropriate neocortex size here and read across, and it gives us a group size of 150. And this apparently is now known as Dunbar's number, which is slightly odd, because I actually think it's an artifact. I'll explain why. Do people live in those kind of groups? I mean, we live in these huge groups. There's a great deal more than 150 of us here. And we can get on perfectly well in these kind of large conurbations. If you actually look at tribal societies, then what pops out very clearly is that very often the number 150 is a core grouping size. So these are census data from tribal societies all around the world, including some American Indian data from the not the last century now, the century before last, the 1880s, 1890s from California, I think. So each sort of column is one tribal society, and you can see they have a number of different kinds of grouping levels, and these are nested within each other. If you like to think of it, even now we live in these kind of social arrangements. You have your family, you have your extended kinship group that the family's part of, extended kinship group is part of the parish is part of a county, and so on. It all builds up. And there's this one grouping level in the middle here, which is absolutely perfectly pitched around the predicted value of 150, which is this red line. The mean is very, very close to that. And these dotted lines here, just the statistical confidence intervals around that prediction. So most of the data ought to lie within that. And you can see the red ones do. They're of a particular kind, associated very often with a name like a clan or a regional grouping or something like that. They're a virtual group. They almost never meet as a whole, but they have very particular relationships with each other. They're very different from these smaller groupings, the band, or these larger groupings, the tribe and the megabands. And there's lots of kind of casual examples. People start to send me these things in, actually, after a while. I don't need any more. We have a very long list of them. But this is just a sort of selection of other examples of this. And I'll really just point out one. Well, there's some nice American ones. Here's the Mormons going off on their great trek. Brigham Young, when he was sending them off, I think there were 5,000 altogether that went off on the great trek to Salt Lake City. He realized he was going to have a real coordination problem. So apparently, so I'm told, and I'm told on authority, this is actually what it says in the Mormon Museum in Salt Lake City. He split them into groups of 150. Sent them off in little parties like that. This is the one I really want to mention here, the Hutterites, because they're just next door. They're just over there in North Dakota. Now, remember, the Hutterites are communal Christian, fairly fundamentalist Christian group that came here from Middle Europe with a very communal-based lifestyle. So they farm communal farms. Everything is done communally. Obviously, they all live in their families, but all the work, even the washing up and the cooking, is often done communally. This figure is just at the lower limits of the confidence limits around the prediction of 150. The reason it's 107, and I have this simply from the Hutterite data themselves, citing the Hutterites, is that they will not allow their communities to get bigger than 150. And they would rather split them when they get to that number and set up a daughter farm somewhere else and start a new community. And the reason they do that is very clear. If you have more than 150 people in the community, you've got to have a police force. And their whole ethos is against having hierarchies and police forces and things like that. So to avoid that problem, they do it by keeping the numbers down. That means everything can be done by peer pressure alone. And people will respond to mild complaints about behavior, for example, by changing their behavior. They won't say, in our communities, if you go along and say, we really didn't like what you did Saturday night, most people will say, well, you know what you can do with your complaint, don't you? If you've got less than 150, it's a very, very different story because people have obligations to each other. It's all a matter of trust and reciprocity. You're bonded into this very intense. You may fight like hell with them, but still, when the chips are down, you'll lay your life on the floor for them. And that sense of obligation causes them to operate in this sort of way. Exactly the same among the Nebraska Amish, who paradoxically have nothing to do with Nebraska. They live in Pennsylvania. So this set us about looking to see if we could find real data on human social networks. And this was our first attempt. I rather like it because it's about Christmas cards. We just asked a bunch of people to write down the long list, and some of them are very long, of names of the people who they were in the households they were sending Christmas cards to. And you have a big range of variation. Here's Tim Robinson up here with it's about 300 personal friends that he knows in great detail. This is Mr. No Mates down here, that's me. But the mean, and it's very, it's sort of a lot of variance in there, but there's a very strong peak, and the mean is almost exactly on 150. It's 153, as you can see. And one of the other things we asked them to do is to say for every single person on that list, when they last saw them, how many months ago did they last see them personally, and how do they feel about them on an intimacy scale from 0 to 10? So 0 is, I couldn't care less really, and 10 is, they're my deepest something or other. So this just plots time since last contact. So this is yesterday, this is several months ago, and here we have this intimacy score from 0 down here to 10 up here. And you'll see this lovely correlation. We've replicated this correlation on a number of occasions with completely different data sets, and it's very, very robust. The exception of these guys down here, I just draw these to your attention because if you notice, you see them very often, but you can't bear them. No, they're not your family. That's your family down there. They're the people you work with. Okay, if you look at these data a bit more closely, you will notice that they kind of set off into a series, almost like a series of subgroups here. And that made us think that maybe actually this 150 that we all think about actually is not in itself a unitary thing. It actually consists of a series of sublayers with different numbers of individuals in it. So I'm not going to show you the analyses. We had to use fractal mathematics to analyze these data. In fact, we analyzed two sets of data and got exactly the same story. One was the Christmas card data, the other was our ethnographic grouping size data. And although these data were completely different, we ended up with exactly the same picture, that your world consists, here's your 150, consists of a series of, oh, we've lost the inner circles, never mind. There's a couple of inner circles in here. And the size of those circles are very consistent. So we're adding numbers as we go through. There's you in the center. This is your social world. There's you in the center. These are your 5 closest people. Some people have a little less, some people have a little more, but they're typically 5. And then there's another circle outside, which consists of about another 10 people, making 15 altogether. And then you add some more in. Makes 50, 150. And as you go down through this, these circles, the number increases, the intimacy declines, and the frequency of contact declines at the same time. And we know there are 2 further circles at least beyond that. There's another one at 500, there's another one beyond that at 1500. This is why I say Dunbar, which is Dunbar's number, because I don't know. But the interesting thing is that they scale very tightly with this a ratio of almost exactly 3, or a little over 3, which is, we have no idea why it should be 3 or why it should scale in that way. But it's very robust. Somebody else has recently shown it with another set of hunter-gatherer data, separate set of hunter-gatherer data. They got a little bit bigger figures, than about 3.8, but it's in very much the same ballpark. And we've just shown that you get exactly the same scaling ratio if you look at these hierarchically organized social systems of things like orcas, the killer whales, in elephants, and again in many of the primates. So it's clearly a widespread thing. And it raises 2 questions, really, is what sets the limit on these layers in your personal friendship networks? Is it the frequency that you interact with them? To have a very close relationship in here, do you have to spend a lot of time with them? And therefore, the fact that the time in the world is limited, unfortunately, there's only a limited number of people you can afford to invest that amount of time getting to know, if you like, and continuing maintaining the relationship afterwards? Or is it a cognitive constraint? Is it that you only have 5 boxes at emotional intensity 10? And if somebody else hoves into a view in your neighborhood and you want to kind of bring them in here, then somebody else has got to drop out. And we have no idea what the dynamics of that is, the problem we're currently working on. Just to highlight how widespread this phenomenon is, here's this rule of 3, again, in military structures. All modern armies are organized basically on this principle. Everything's in sections of 3. You usually get some extra sort of headquarters bits and other sort of accessories added on at each stage, but essentially the main working parts, you get 3 bits, they add up, and it all works very nicely. Now, here's a test for you. I just point out the company. Right? The company comes out absolutely spot on, very close to the size of 150. It's just a little, on average, just a little over, taking all the armies of the world, which this is based on. The army is the company really is the fundamental structure. It's the smallest unit that can stand on its own 2 feet independently. And it seems the rest of it is sort of built up, kind of, as it were, out of that. I wonder if you know who really created this structure for modern armies. It's this gentleman here. You don't know who he is? Surely you do. Of course. It's Gustavus Adolphus himself. Okay. Oh, in his period, during the 30 Years' War in Europe, he was the finest military general and military thinker of his time, and much admired afterwards. And I'm told much admired for what he did back in Sweden as well, as the king of Sweden. Hence, he's often regarded as one of the greatest kings of Sweden, which is why we have this place here. And the president has actually just asked me just to point out to any Gusties here that if you didn't get that, you're getting a fail grade. All right, how do primates bond their social groups? Well, it seems to be a dual process. One of it involves this stuff, grooming. Now, grooming is very intense for them. They spend a huge amount of time doing it. It's not just about removing bits of muck from fur. It goes beyond that. It's a bit like kind of cuddling and petting and massage in humans. It actually has the same effect as those. It's very pleasurable when you're being groomed by primates, much as it is when you're being petted and cuddled and so on by a human. So that's this sort of emotionally intense component, and I'll show you in a minute why it seems to have that effect. But the other component is clearly this. And what I think happens is, and this is just a guess really at this point, is you need this kind of physiological mechanism to set up a kind of internal pharmacological state which allows you to build a cognitive relationship of trust and reciprocity somehow. But we have no idea how that really works. Clearly, however, it has something to do with this stuff. And John just showed you one of the classic tests, the so-called Sally-Ann test of false belief. Everybody assumes that this kind of special social cognition is what really makes the world tick for primates and what demarcates them in particular, and we have it in spades. And this form of social cognition is often put in the form of orders of intentionality. Intentionality is having beliefs about in your mind, as it were, about other individuals or the world out there. And so you can sort of structure them in a sort of set of a sequence, reflexive sequence. Here's Jack. He believes that X is the case. Jill here believes that Jack believes that X is the case, so she's in second order. She's got handling two belief states in her mind. Jack here again now is in third order because he believes that Jill believes that Jack believes that something is the case. So he's handling three. And this, in principle, it goes on beyond that, essentially in an unlimited direction in principle. This one here is very critical. Second order intentionality, it's theory of mind. Children acquire that at about the age of 5. That's the point at which children are able to understand that other individuals have mind states which differ from their own. So that's the point at which they learn to lie with conviction. They're also the point at which they can engage in fictive play and pretend play, that pulling a piece of string behind you with a train, a car attached to it, or whatever it may be. It's the car really is going along. They can have those kind of imaginative things. So we don't get science below that come what may. That's, if you like, the minimal, because at that point you're standing back far enough from the world to imagine that the world could be different. It set us wondering just what the limits are for normal adult humans. So we ran a series of sort of extended false belief type tasks running up to 9th order. I think, well, one set ran up to 9th order. This was a set we did up to 6th order with Peter Kinderman. It's actually the first data set where we tried this. So you had these little stories about people trying to make arrangements for dates or get a pay rise or something like that, thinking through the mind states of the various characters involved. And then we have a control here, which is just factual questions about the story and the general setting of the story that have no mind states in it. And you can see that even when they're trying to causally relate up to 6 or 7 different facts in this kind of sequential situation, they have no trouble at all. But when they're trying to handle mind states, when you get up to 5th order, is about the absolute upper limit. It really plummets after that. They tend to find these mentalizing problems extremely difficult after fifth order. So this is the average, and we've repeated this experiment in lots of different ways. We keep getting fifth order as the limit. Something like 70% of people have their limit at or below here. And just to give you a sense of what fifth order is about, here's a little example that I'll let you read. Okay, if you got that, you get an A grade. If you didn't get it, too bad. Okay, so they're actually quite difficult to handle, and there's some sense that maybe without language we can't actually get up to fifth order. It would actually be quite difficult to do. But children go through this progression where they acquire second order at about age 5, and then third order at about age 9 or so, fourth order at about 10, 11, and they get up to adult levels in their early teens. Well, we asked one group of people, as well as doing these tests, to also make a list of their inner circle of close friends. And this is what the data looked like. So here's the number of close friends they had. Here's their scores on these mind-reading tasks, the limit that they could cope with, the upper limit. So some people didn't do very well, first order. Some people claimed actually it went up to ninth order, and I have to say I didn't write these. My limit was actually about sixth order. I wrote the first set, and it nearly broke my mind to do it, frankly. But the graduate student that did this particular study actually claimed he could write up to ninth order. But in general, forgetting the tail ends, it doesn't really matter. There's a nice relationship here. The number of friends you have increases with your competencies on these kind of social cognition tasks. There's a lot of variance in the data. We know where some of that variance comes from. Some of it's personality differences, some of it's age effects, some of it's a gender effect. I'm not telling you which one does better than the other. That's because half of you know anyway, and the other half couldn't care. However, what is really scary is this stuff shows up in your brain, as you might expect, it really does. So this is some imaging studies we've just finished last year. They're unpublished, so you're getting the first public airing of this stuff. This is just showing that these mentalizing tasks, as you go up through these orders, it really is neurally taxing. It's hard work for the brain to cope with them. What we've shown is that, in particular, in these three areas here, which are also pitch up as the three core areas associated with theory of mind competences, second order intentionality, I believe that you think that something's the case, which is where most of the work has been done, or in fact all the work has been done. When people are being tested for those kind of competences, what 5-year-old kids can do, for heaven's sakes. These are the three areas that keep coming up. For those of you who really want to know, that's in the dorsal prefrontal cortex. This is the temporal parietal junction, just back here, and this is on the temporal pole, just up in there. So, and this is the right dorsal prefrontal cortex as well, whereas these two, it's usually both sides. But the key point here is that as you go up through the orders of intentionality between order 2 and order 6 that we took them up to, these areas are working much harder at each level. They're actually working harder, and they're recruiting more neural material as they do it as well. So the brain, one of the reasons clearly that we need a big brain is this kind of mentalizing ability that allows us to think through the implications of the social world we live in is very, very hard work. We also did a structural analysis on another set of people, and what comes out very nicely is actually the number of close friends you have in these inner circles correlates very nicely with the size of this area here, the dorsal prefrontal cortex. So now we don't even need to ask questions of people. We can just go and measure this, and we know all about you. Of course, there's lots of individual differences in there, and it's not just all phrenology, which is what it's in danger of looking like. Okay, so back to the grooming component now. That's the sort of cognitive bit. Back to the grooming component. If you look at time spent grooming in primates against social group size, these are species averages here, there's a general increase in time given to grooming. So as your group size increases, you have to groom more. You're not grooming more people, actually. You're grooming your close buddies much more, as though to make the relationship work even better. It's on a pretty much a linear trend, and we've reanalyzed these in newer data, and we get exactly the same result. But it kind of levels off here at about 20% of time. So these are gelada out here with their huge groups. It looks as though there's a kind of upper limit here that you can afford to spend in this otherwise useless activity when you could be feeding, for example. This is clearly just an ecological effect. I mean, you have to feed in real life. You have to go out there and work. You can't spend all your life engaged in social interaction. So this sets this upper limit here in primates in general. Just to show you what's going on in terms of grooming, I mentioned it's very relaxing, it makes you feel kind of very happy and so on. It's because it's extremely good at releasing endorphins. Endorphins are the brain's own painkiller. They're related to the morphine family, but they're non-addictive. They're slightly different chemically, and you don't get addicted to them in the same way that you do to the artificial opiates. And this is a little experiment done some years ago by Barry Cavern, a colleague of mine in Cambridge, in which they showed that if you give very, very low doses of morphine, so small that you wouldn't be able to detect them in blood tests immediately afterwards, interest in grooming plummets compared to, here's a saline control. They're just given salt water, basically. Compared to these, your interest in engaged in social interaction, so the amount of grooming or the number of grooming partners you have or the amount of grooming you ask for drops. In contrast, if you give them an opiate blocker, in this case a fairly inert drug called naltrexone, which simply locks onto the opiate receptor sites in the brain and won't let the endorphins get in there, you just can't get enough. You go crazy because you're not getting the release from it, from the grooming, that you would normally be getting. So you just keep asking for more and more and more. And this may be one reason why morphine drug addicts become totally asocial, because they're just, it's not spaced out, they're blocked out. They don't need social interaction to get this buzz that seems to underpin our relationships. Okay, so what is the effect of this for humans? Well, if we plug humans with our groups of 150 into this primate line, and we ignore the fact that there's an upper limit, we would have to spend about 43% of our daytime engaged in social grooming if we were to bond our groups the way primates do. So this is a big gap here. There's a lot missing, because if you look at real human data, and these are time spent in social interaction by a whole range of people, from people in Dundee in Scotland to herders Maasai herders in Tanzania, hill farmers in Nepal. The average is absolutely bang on the 20%. This is just variance around here. Remember, these are averages for individual species, so there's a lot of variance around here too. These are bang on. There's this big gap missing here, the so-called bonding gap, which clearly we don't have the time to do. We're as constrained as monkeys. It looks like we're using the same amount of time, but somehow using it more efficiently. And you all know, if you spend that amount of social time in your life, nearly half your day engaged in socializing, you would get nothing done. I mean, the only people that have that amount of spare time is academics, let's face it. So somehow we have to cut through the glass ceiling here, and here's one suggestion. That's what language was triggered to solve the problem of. And language is very good because it allows us to cut through many of the blockages that limit grooming. You can exchange information about the social network. Monkeys and apes know only what they see, whereas you can go around telling people what's happened and catch up with the news. You can talk to more people at the same time, so here's a standard conversation group. We can talk to 4 or 5 people at the same time. A little conversation group of 4 or 5 people works very well. It's actually the upper limit. Can't get more people into a conversation than about that. But still, that's considerably more than grooming for monkeys, which is very much a one-on-one activity. We can talk and walk, we can talk and do other things. We can use it to share knowledge, that's creating a sense of community and bonding. But there is a problem with language. However wonderful it is, it's very poor at expressing emotional content, as you all know. It's probably the reason we admire poets so much, is that they can put in words stuff that about our inner feelings that we mostly really can't do. We're very poor at expressing the emotional content. But it's also worse than that. It doesn't arouse any emotions most of the time. It doesn't solve the endorphin gap particularly, or at least not particularly well. So what might have solved that? Well, here's 3 suggestions as to what's happened on the way. This is more by way of hypothesis than anything else. So what we have here is time into the past. Here we are now. This is predicted grooming time for all fossil hominid populations. Here's Lucy and her lot down here. We're up here somewhere where this red line is. And it's simply based on taking the fossil crania, calculating brain size from that, and then interpolating these values through the graphs into neocortex size, from neocortex size to group size to grooming time. And you can see here's the 20%, the Australopithecines, they're just apes. They're in the same border, that's fine. And then it starts to take off. We're probably not too worried, sort of at least down in this sort of sector here, we can have a little spillover, but certainly once we get up here, the required social bonding time is far beyond what we can afford to do. So we need something really to cut through this gap before we get to language, and likely language only came in sort of somewhere around here, perhaps as at the latest 500,000 years ago with the appearance of archaic humans. I think these 3 fill in the gap. They're all unique to humans with the exception of this which we share with chimpanzees, laughter. They have a form of laughter, they don't use it as intensively as we do. But laughter, music, and I mean the performance of music, not sort of concert music in the sense of sitting while the orchestra on the stage is doing what we're interested in, as it were, but the audience really isn't. I'm talking about engaged in performance of music, as in traditional societies, where you might sit around the campfire and have a sing-song. And also religion, and particularly the rituals of religion, not necessarily the intellectual content, the theology, as it were. So, and I think they probably came in this order, that laughter came in first, simply because we share that with chimpanzees, so it was already there. What's interesting is about laughter is it's also highly synchronized and segmented. And dancing and music performance, as orchestral players will know, is very dependent on the ability to synchronize and segment your behavior, as it were, because that's how the music's structured, and so is language. So I think we go from here to here, and naturally a very quick jump into language. Once you've got this kind of vocal singing, as it were, without words, in the context of music and dancing, it's a very, very short step into language. So I just want to also point out, and I'll just show you a bit of evidence in a second, that all 3 of these are very good at triggering endorphin release. And I'll just show you evidence for the sake of time for here. This is it's actually 2 studies pooled together that we did a couple of years ago, looking at the impact of laughing on pain tolerance. So your pain tolerance is simply a good assay for endorphin release, because that's part of the pain control mechanism. And all we did was we showed people, or we first of all gave them a pain test. Sometimes we use an old-fashioned blood monitor, blood pressure monitor. Sometimes we use a cold hand or hand in an ice bucket. Anything like that will do. See how long they can stand this. Show them something like a video or get them to do something, and then test for their pain tolerance again. If you show them a very boring tourist video, happened to be from Nevada, actually. I beg your pardon, not Nevada, Nebraska. But I take the blame for that because my granny was born in Fontanelle. So there's no difference. I mean, there's a lot of variance around here, but the average is absolutely smack on zero. There's no real effect. If you do it with a comedy video, and people are in groups to laugh, they're all in groups of 4, and you measure the amount of time they spend laughing, then even without that point down there, there's a very significant relationship. And we've shown this now with drumming circles, we've shown it with singing in church services, and we've shown it in rowing eights, these eights on the river. And what is interesting about that, and particularly interesting in the context of creating, what I think this is doing is creating this upsurge of a sense of belonging to a community. And what we've been able to show both with the drumming data from drumming circles and with the rowers, that if you do it on your own, you don't get such a strong effect. If you do it as a group, and particularly a synchronized group, as in drumming or as in rowing, where everybody has to be absolutely in time together, then you get this huge upsurge, and you come out of it with this sense of real belonging to this little community. And it has knock-on consequences. And again, this is an unpublished study, although we're just trying to replicate one bit of it before we send it off for publication. If you do that same kind of study, and then you put the people into a public goods game where you give them, say, in pairs, you give one member of the pair $5 or something, and they can offer the other member of the pair any proportion they like between 0 and 100%, but the other person can accept or decline it. And if they decline it, neither of you get anything. What you find is that people who watch a neutral video here or a comedy video that come with a friend as their pairmate show no difference at all. But if you come and are paired up with a complete stranger, then watching a comedy video and laughing together massively improves your willingness to offer. In fact, you give them 50-50. If you watch a boring video, then the average is something below a 1 to 4 payoff ratio split. You're much meaner to them. Be happy. That's the answer. Okay, so the question is, why don't you go out and do it on its own? I mean, if it's just endorphins, go out. Lots of people do. Just around the corner here, you can go and watch them on the way to coffee. The answer is, I think, if you do it on its own, you don't get this huge upsurge that you get. Now, the question is, how do you get people to do that? And I think that's where the theology part of religion, if you like, comes in. That it makes you keep turning up as a group on a regular basis to engage in this kind of communal bonding process. And I think this is where the theory of mind components become very, very important, because if you do a kind of task analysis of what kind of religion you get out, if you have only third order or fourth order or fifth order intentionality, you get a very, very different kind of religion. At third order, it is purely personal. It's your beliefs and pretty much that's it. At fourth order, it's pretty much, you can persuade somebody else about your beliefs, but you really need a police force to make them go along with you. At fifth order, you're automatically sucked into both agreeing, and in a way which you can't really get out of very easily. It's kind of hard to see this. I'll illustrate it with storytelling, the other half of where I started, because it's much, much easier to see. It's absolutely glaringly obvious. So here's Shakespeare's story, Othello. You all know this story. There's Iago telling Othello these wicked lies about Desdemona down here. What are the cognitive processes that are going on here in terms of mind reading? Well, if you think about it, the audience believes that Iago intends Othello to suppose that Desdemona is in love with somebody else. Okay, so at that point, the audience is operating in fourth order intentionality. They're having to cope with 4 sets of mind states on the stage at the same time. But this is not a very interesting story. This is a Jeffrey Archer novel. It's kind of an eternal triangle, but it's not really, it's a quick read and it's fun and so on. It's not very demanding on you. And anyway, who cares why should Othello care if Desdemona is in love with somebody? It's just a fantasy. Everybody has fantasies. Doesn't matter. What makes the story bite is that Iago persuades Othello that Cassio reciprocates Desdemona's love, that they're going to run off together. And at that point, you get beyond a Jeffrey Archer novel into a Shakespeare play. But the audience is now having to work at fifth order. They're working at their limit. And if you think about what that means is, when Shakespeare sat down to write that play, he was having to work one level higher still. So he was having to work at sixth order, and now we're talking about special people. So this is my pitch on why we can all enjoy stories. And the more we're pushed to our limits by the author and getting us up to our cognitive limits, the more we enjoy the story, the more oomph we get out of it, as it were, the more it drags us in. But to be able to do that, you really have to go beyond the levels that most normal people can cope with. And that's why you should value good authors. Just... So just to finish off very quickly, let me now go back to where we started and show you why that's only possible for humans. This is very sketchy data, but it's all we have, I'm afraid. If you look at these competencies and intentionality, we know humans are at fifth order. We know all the monkeys and everybody else seems to be at first order. Everybody's pretty much agreed about that. The apes, and the black dot is chimpanzees, the only ones we have data for, just about cope with second order. They're not very good. They're probably about as good as children aged 4. Whoa! They're about as good as children aged 4. They're not as good as children who have full, here's my rescuer, full theory of mind competence. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, guys. They said if I did that, it would turn the whole thing off. They didn't realize I was going to test to see if they could do it. Good. Okay. What is extraordinary, and these other open dots are simply the brain sizes or frontal lobe volumes of all the other species we have, of monkeys and apes we have data for. And you'll just notice they cluster very, very tightly around these 2 points. But these 3 points here just lie on a very straight line. And if that's the case, this big difference here is huge. And if you look at actually frontal lobe volumes in effect in humans, so this is total brain volume for primates, split into, on the bottom here, the visual areas, which are at the back, which are a huge chunk of your brain, and the sort of bits more frontal to that. It's a bit more than just the frontal lobe here, but we can't split it any other way. What's interesting is this huge chunk you use for vision increases a bit with brain size, but not a lot. But the rest of the stuff up front, and that's really the business end for this kind of cognition, is just going up through the roof. And so it may be no surprise that it's only when you get to the brain size of apes that you start to see these early stages of higher orders of intentionality, second order intentionality. And it's no surprise, surely, that it's only humans that have the capacity to get up to fifth order, and thus to have science, the arts, drama, and so on, and in the end, religion too. Thank you very much.
We could ask our panelists to come up once again. Questions for Dr. Dunbar, please write them down, pass them to the center aisle. The ushers will pick them up. We'll resume here in just a few minutes.
We'll talk maybe in Oxford a little bit. I would love to talk.
Well, I can hear myself now. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? I guess not. So again, if you have some questions, pass them quickly to the audience, to the ushers. Otherwise, we'll begin by giving our panelists an opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Dunbar. Where do we start here? Dr. Pabo.
Okay, so I found it fascinating that parts of the brain, as did you say dorsal prefrontal cortex, correlate with the number of friends you have or your social group. Can one go to fossil forms of humans and ask for habilis or Homo erectus or Neanderthals, what were their numbers of friends?
I was hoping Curtis was going to do that.
I'll leave that to you.
The answer is no, because that's individual differences between within species, and you really don't get enough. You can't measure that kind of individual variation on brain size or brain bit size. In fossils is the problem, I don't think, anyway. You can kind of, it's so imprecise anyway, and then you can't measure that bit of the brain anyway, even from the impressions in the inside. It's not good enough. So the best you can do is what we have done with the general group size analyses of predicting group sizes for populations as a whole, where we can do it using the general equations by interpolation, and that just gives you a ballpark figure. But I don't think you'd probably get, unluckily.
Bad, yeah.
Dr. Marion.
Yeah, just a point and a question. And I was interested in what you were talking about with the impact of grooming on endorphin stimulation. And of course, in traditional societies, they lack mirror technology. So the application of cosmetics is a social activity, unlike in the daily activity of people in our society where it's a private activity in front of a mirror. Maybe the analogy might be the local hairstylist functions as a social activity of cosmetic production and stimulation of the head and so on. But in traditional societies, the application of body paints and so on is a social activity that in many ways mimics grooming because of the bodily contact. And it happens both between men and women, but not across the sexes. Have you looked at that activity to see if it has a similar reaction as grooming does in primates? And I'm wondering if that could be a transition out of grooming for humans.
We haven't looked at it, and it would be a great project for a PhD student. But we know that, I mean, some of our data come from hair care networks, as we call them, in the Kung San, some of our data on the inner cliques. And in those kind of societies where you don't have a hairdresser, small groups, and I guess it goes on here in sort of more rural communities, and even in the developed West, where in rural communities you have these little groups of friends who will do each other's hair. But I guess, I mean, I think that's why when you go to the hairdresser, particularly women, where it's a longer process, we just go in, quick, run with the razor and it's out, as it were. But for women, it's a longer thing. I don't know, ladies, do you get this kind of uplift from the endorphins?
let me just come in with a question here from one of our internet viewers here to follow up on that. How does the development of such social networking technologies as Facebook or MySpace impact human capacities for relationship? He says, I have over 1,000 close friends on my Facebook site.
Thank you for contributing to our database. Because we're actually doing a couple of projects on Facebook and MySpace at the moment. The mobile phone companies have got really interested in these kind of social networks because it affects how big the space you really need to have just on things like MySpace and so on, the networking. And it actually affects how big the technology has to be on these virtual world gaming environments. It turns out that they have exactly these kind of structures that we found in ordinary people, even on these virtual environments. Yes, people claim to have huge, and the other reason is, of course, the technologists think that they can cut through some of these glass ceilings by increasing the broadcast pattern that you can have, because you can send an email out to tens of thousands of people literally, and that saves you a lot of time. The real question is, what's the quality of relationship you have with them? Because we are embedded in this extensive series of circles of acquaintanceship, which goes on forever. It stops with the 6 billionth and 2 people that are now alive on the Earth, and probably includes your pets as well on the way. The number 150 is simply the number of people you know as persons, that if you bumped into them in Hong Kong airport at 3 a.m. on a stopover at the bar, you wouldn't even think twice about going up to them and saying hello and how are you and stuff, because you know who they are and they know who you are. There's lots of people you know beyond that. The limit of about 1,500 is quite well documented now as the number of people whose faces you can put names to. And that's much bigger, clearly. It's an order of magnitude beyond the 150. So you can have large numbers of people, but the question I have to ask you is, what is the quality of your relationship with them? And you assume that they're all equal, but in fact, not really. It turns out not really so. And certainly from all the work that's been done on Facebook, most people have circles of 150. And that's about it.
Dr. Van Huisteen.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was such a fascinating lecture. And your answer now leads into a question that I wanted to ask exactly about what you call the quality of close relationship. You made a distinction. You talked about circles of acquaintanceship and then asked what sets limits to those. Is it, time investment, or is it some cognitive restraint? So I'm just wondering, is there also a third option, or is the first one? It sounds like the more time you have, the more friends you might have that are very close to you. When I would say, how do you account for personal choices to have, say, very few close relationships that are very intense? And the same kind of question towards the end when you talked about religions and various strata of community. The bigger the community, the more you are sucked in. But what about the quality of religious experience if you choose for more personal investment and individual experience?
Yeah. Let me take that last point first, as I probably should have commented on that. It seems to me that I'm thinking here in terms of the evolution of religion and how it kind of got going and where it came from. And it seems to me that it has very much that feel of being a small community thing. It's for bonding these very, very small scale communities. And I wonder whether this explains why most religions, most of the big world religions, are so prone to fragmentation in terms of cults and sects. And that things like the house church movement that's grown up in Protestant Christianity in particular is kind of reflecting the same thing, that these very big churches, as it were, or congregations, are just too big for you to handle. It's a much more intimate kind of experience that you're getting, or that you want. And what a lot of these mechanisms are designed to kind of create this sense of belonging. And now I've forgotten the first question, where you started.
Well, the distinction you made between a close circle of acquaintances between time constraints, or time investment in time, and cognitive constraints, and how the balance of that works, and how personal choices may affect that circle of close acquaintances.
The answer is we don't know. I mean, that is actually what we're trying to figure out right now with a whole series of kind of studies of social networks at this kind of level. One thing I might sort of answer with a kind of a caricature, as it were, a story, and that is, it seemed to me that, and it goes back to the question about electronic media as well, that you know, with all these big multinational companies scattered around the world, you know, some accountant somewhere would figure out it's much cheaper to give everybody a video conferencing system, and then they'd save on these very expensive business trips all around the world, and a huge carbon footprint. And this would be the saving grace. Now, I bet a company that did that would be bust in a year, because what's important when these guys go on business trips is not that they go and negotiate something. It's the same, you know, this adage, all business is done on the golf course. It's not that they're doing business on the golf course. They're getting to know each other. They're getting to trust each other as individuals. That's all. And if they don't have that sense of quality of relationship, when one of them rings up from, let's say, Boise, Idaho, Hewlett-Packard's big lab over this side of the pond, and rings up their colleagues over at the Bristol lab in England and says, listen, guys, we've got a problem, can you help me out? If they haven't got to know each other, the response is going to be, listen, guys, we've got problems over here too, you know, sort yourselves out first. Whereas if they've got really to know and trust each other, then they'll come back and say, okay, well, we'll do our best. It's not ideal right now.
Dr. Stanford?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting discussion. And the thing that I would be real curious about is that figure of 150 for the group size, which appears to be optimal in hunting-gathering groups. As that group grows bigger, then you see fission. Yes. And I think maybe if we could plot that on kind of on a map, like we've been doing with the Clovis artifact distribution, we can see how that fission would work and why.
Absolutely, and actually this raises a big issue vis-a-vis the archaeological record, both, you know, at your end, the recent archaeology, and at your end, the deep archaeology, if you like, because we can make predictions about, if you like, about what any given population, species, subspecies of ancestral hominids, group sizes might have been. But when you look in the archaeological record, what you see is the overnight camp, which is typically in modern hunter-gatherers in the 30 to 50 range. It's that 50, inner 50 grouping rather than the 150, which is much more diffuse. Yet that 150 socially is probably much more important than the temporary campsite. Now, our problem is, how do we get together from our two ends? We need to go out more.
Yes, absolutely.
Here's a question from the audience. Do you believe language and religion occurred simultaneously?
No. And yes. Because it depends on what you mean by religion. Right? The view, if you like, is no more than idle speculation, is that religion kind of is developed through a series of stages. I don't think this is terribly controversial in the kind of religious studies area. It's what everybody, this is sort of consensus view, that you started off with these kind of hunter-gatherer type, shamanistic type religions, and maybe you can talk about them after tea. And gradually these developed or evolved historically into the world religions that we know and love, as it were, that we have today. So my suspicion is that these kind of traditional society, shamanistic type religions were triggered, it's just a speculation really, triggered by the fact that humans find it very easy to trigger these trance states. We can do it by any number of different things, you know, that's Bill Clinton's problem. He never inhaled. There are all sorts of ways you can do it. Dancing is very good. That's why the trance dancing circles of the Kung San produce these trance states. You go off into this world of the mind, and you experience all these extraordinary things in there. And you have to have an experience. It's very, very real, as indeed all these kind of religious, ecstatic experiences are. You have to have an explanation for it. So you then start to think in terms of, if you like, a theology for that kinds of explain it. But that early stage has, my guess is it came in possibly even pre-language, but I suspect not very long before language came, as a mechanism of social bonding. That once you've got language, however, that changes the picture, because now you can add a kind of theology of some sort to it, which explains why it all works, and that's part of the bonding process itself. It also allows you to say, listen, you guys, you've got to keep coming every week, or whenever it is, that you can make the arrangements, which is what the Kung San do. They use it for repairing damaged social relationships in the community. People get fractious with each other in the community, and then after a while, somebody will say, let's have a trance dance on Saturday. So they all get together in the barn and they have the trance dance, and that kind of repairs relationships in the community, and then it's sort of, for a while, and then things deteriorate again. So that sort of sense of very early religion, I can see coming in without language. But I think to make religion work fully, engage the community, then it made a big difference to have language, because you could explain why you have to do this kind of stuff.
Okay. Here's a question. I think this must be from a teacher. Any way to build your ability to handle higher levels of intentionality?
Are you paying money for this?
Read Shakespeare.
Read Shakespeare, perhaps. Yeah.
It's too late. But it's clear that individuals can learn. We actually did a project a couple of years ago. It finished. It's not yet been published either, in which we tried to improve people's performance on certain kinds of cognitive components of theory of mind, partitioned up into its components, and see if we could train them to do better. And by and large, younger kids were the ones that showed the big improvements. It's well known that the speed at which you acquire theory of mind, how well you do it as children, bearing in mind it's very young children, depends on the number of siblings you have. It's social exposure, really. So, no, I'm sorry, it's too late.
Question about, could you describe experiments that could be used to test for theory of mind in animals? What degree do other animals have?
Oh, this is very difficult. We tried it with dolphins. It is a very illuminating story, so my apologies if I tell it in its full length, because it illustrates how difficult it is to do. We'd done, colleagues had done, we had done some with chimpanzees, and colleagues had done some with chimpanzees, and they were reasonably successful. So somebody came along who was interested in dolphins, a bit of a dolphin nut, I may use the term. Very keen to show that dolphins are very smart. And so we sent him off to South Africa with this design. The design's very simple. It's based on the Sally-Ann type task. And it involved having two boxes which were put on the side of the pool. One of them was baited by an experimenter, and an observer was looking over the shoulder. This was behind a little screen. The observer went out of the room. The boxes were moved out to the side. The screen had been taken away. The boxes moved out to the side. And the experimenter either swapped the boxes over or didn't. Right? So if he didn't swap them over, it's a true belief task because the observer knows which box was baited. If they were swapped over, it's a false belief task because the observer thinks the box over here was baited, but actually now it's been moved over this side. So the experimenter comes back in. We get the dolphin to come right in front, in the middle, and the observer points to the box that she, in this case, thought was the one that was baited. Well, the dolphins were phenomenal. Chimpanzees take about 80 trials, incredibly slow, to learn the basic task before you get to the test. Dolphins got it in 8. Right? Okay, these are performing dolphins. They got it in 8. And they were absolutely spot-on perfect, A-grade students. Every time, didn't matter, false belief, true belief, task, mixed up. They got it right every time. This is phenomenal. Nobel Prizes loomed. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of looking at the video. Well, actually, what made me think about it was there was one task where the observer made a mistake and forgot what kind of trial she was on. And she thought she was on a false belief trial, and the dolphin knew she wasn't. Right? So this made us a bit suspicious. So we looked at what the dolphins were doing, and they're so smart. This is, no skin off their nose intellectually, because it just shows how smart they are. They were picking up on how the experimenter was dipping her shoulder. If she put the bait into the right-hand box, she tended just to drop this shoulder a fraction. And if she did it with the left-hand box, she dropped this shoulder. So we had a group of naive people look at these tapes, and they were nearly as good as the dolphins, not quite. I mean, the dolphins got it every single time. They got it right. So we then, a bit frustrated, we decided we'd do it with a new set of observers, new dolphins, new design, much tighter control. Oh, the other thing the dolphins were doing was they would come up to the center point, the observer would tap the box to show them which one, and the dolphin would swing to one side and then drift down. And of course, the experimenter then was left in the difficult position of saying, did they mean this box or this box? And they were very nice people. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Anyway, we tried it in Florida with with the dolphins that come in from the sea to one of these facilities, petting and patting facilities, as it were. So they're free-ranging dolphins. And we were much, much tighter constraints on these kind of what are called clever hands problems. Comparative psychologists live in terror of clever hands problems, which are these, no matter how smart your experiments, animals can outwit you. And they just couldn't do it. So it's those kind of designs, but the real problem is, and the problem everybody has had who's been trying to do these kind of studies on great apes in particular, and at Leipzig, where Svante Pääbo is the sort of one of the meccas for that kind of stuff, it is really, really difficult to design experiments which allow you to be sure that the animal has actually understood what the problem is and is demonstrating whether or not they have the capacity to do it. And it's not just that they're bored or disinterested or they just haven't figured out what it is you're trying to do. And we have the same problem, obviously, with very, very young children who pre-speech children. Again, it's hard to design experiments because with adults you can explain the bases of it.
Okay. I believe I read somewhere that the consumption of caffeine increases endorphin levels. And perhaps it's about time that we should break into small groups and engage in group endorphin level raising here for a few minutes. Thank you once again, Dr. Dunbar.